KLSCAH webinar series. KLSCAH stands for the Kuala Lumpur and Selangor Chinese Assembly Hall. I'm your host, Heng. I'm the Chief Executive of KLSCAH. Today's topic is tackling the COVID-19 pandemic, MCO, emergency, and alternative. Before I introduce the speaker, I would have three announcements. First, we are having Facebook Live concurrently at Kini TV and KLSCAH. So I would like to thank Kini TV for providing the Facebook Live together with us. Secondly, those of you who are in front of the screen, you are encouraged to support our continuous effort to organize more webinars, and any contributions can be made to the Kuala Lumpur and Selangor Chinese Assembly Hall. It's public bank, and the account number is 3077340127. I repeat, 3077340127. And kindly send a copy of the transaction receipt to the Secretariat of KLSCAH as well through our WhatsApp number 0166455702. You will also find similar information on our Facebook as well as on the Kini TV Facebook. Okay, and thirdly, you are encouraged to ask questions. You can post questions on the Facebook of either Kini TV or KLSCAH, and my colleagues they will collect the questions, and later I will pose a question to the speaker. Okay, today it is an honor for us to have Professor Jomo Kwame Sundaram as our guest speaker. I believe all of you would have known Dr. Jomo, a prominent economist. He writes regularly on sustainable development. Dr. Jomo was an economist professor until 2004, and he was also Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development in the United Nations for 10 years, from 2005 to 2015. And Dr. Jomo received the Wassily Leontief Prize for advancing the frontiers of economic thought in 2007. Today's organizer is this KLSCAH, the Kuala Lumpur and Selangor Chinese Assembly Hall. Okay, now before I invite the speaker to begin his presentation, let me provide a brief background to the topic. On January 12th, our nation was declared under a state of emergency. The statement given to the media during that week was that such a measure is to tackle the surge of COVID-19 positive cases, plus an extension of MCO 2.0 until February 4, which is this Thursday, and it's placed across 7 states, include KL, Putrajaya, and Selangor. So for the first time in history, the emergency ordinance states a suspension of parliamentary as well as legislative meetings during the state of emergency till August 1st. So we are not sure whether there will be any continuation after August 1st or not. Now, this has raised many questions within the Malaysian public, especially by those with expertise in legal scrutiny. Amid these roadblocks, many high-profile institutes have projected Malaysia's GDP to grow at least 6.5%. Some even projected a higher than 6.5% GDP growth. Now, however, experts are concerned with the struggling foreign direct investment, and we have seen over the years income inequality gaps have widened further. Now, in a visible struggle to sustain rates of economic growth, concerns for the nation to be stuck in the middle income trap, and now that we are in the pandemic, continue to rise. So the question now is, how will we reach optimistic GDP growth through a state of emergency? But can this GDP growth projection of 6.5 say anything about the current pandemic situation that we are in? Are there alternatives aside from what the government has been doing? Are there alternatives aside from the MCO? And are there alternatives to the emergency being declared? So with the introduction that I've laid out, now I would like to invite the speaker, Professor Jomo, to give his presentation, and later we will follow by Q&A. Please, Dr. Jomo.
Thank you very much, Heng, for this invitation to speak to this community, and I very much appreciate your interest in this area. I will try to keep my remarks brief so that we have more time for discussion, because it is not clear to me what the interest of your audience mainly is. But let me outline a few things first. I think it's important for us to remember that there was a period during the first few months of the pandemic when many people didn't know what to do. There was a lot of lack of clarity and so on and so forth. But there was also some very constructive behavior. There was also some solidarity. And I think it's very important for us to recognize this at the international level and even at the national level. For example, I think the Selangor Chinese Assembly Hall contributed to certain people who were doing some of the frontliners and those who were making a lot of sacrifices in that period. But let me focus now on trying to understand what the difference was during the early period and the current period. As I said, everybody knows that the pandemic begins at the very end of 2019, probably somewhere in around Wuhan, and we find that the situation was recognized for what it was, that there was what was called a novel coronavirus. And it was subsequently given a specific name, and the disease it caused was referred to as COVID-19. So many of us now refer to it as COVID-19. Now, initially, there was some confusion. There were many people who were suffering from infections towards the end of 2019, but it was the thought that it was some other flu virus. And there have been many flu viruses, and flu viruses mutate all the time, and so this happens not only in China, it happens throughout the world, including in the US. That's why if you are in the West, you are advised to take a different injection every year to vaccinate yourself against the virus. Of course, not everybody does that, but that is become quite a common practice. The virus was recognized as a distinct new virus at the end of 2019, and within two weeks, researchers identified what is called the genome sequence, and this is extremely important because it opened up the research. In other words, the information was shared to everybody who was interested. You could get that information. This is very important because when you share information, other people can use that information and act on that information, and the process can go further. This contrasts with the situation now, where, for example, the companies which have been developing vaccines, they're not sharing information. And so it is very difficult, for example, for people to have access to the vaccines. Let us say there is a vaccine which works very well, and people want to have more of that vaccine, but the current manufacturer can only produce a certain amount of that vaccine. And that manufacturer is only capable of doing that, but there are other manufacturers who can manufacture the vaccine on a greater scale. And for example, the single largest vaccine manufacturer is the Serum Institute of India, which produces hundreds of millions of vaccines every year because they are oriented towards a very large market, not only in India, where there are over 1 billion people, but also internationally. So you have these capacities, but those capacities are not held by the companies which have developed vaccines so far. Now, it is very important, therefore, for there to be cooperation. The more we keep our information to ourselves, the less progress we make. And this, I think, has very important consequences, not only for lives, but also for livelihoods. So as I said earlier, initially there was very little understanding about the virus, little understanding about what was new and what was different about the virus. Many of you know, for example, that there was at the beginning of the century, over almost 2 decades ago, there was the first SARS outbreak. severe acute respiratory syndrome. Now that SARS outbreak is different from this, from the current COVID-19. COVID-19, the virus is referred to as a SARS-2, okay, by some people. But actually, there are many different characteristics. Most importantly, for our purposes, SARS-1 was not very infectious, not as infectious as SARS-2. Okay, in other words, less people were infected in the normal course of events, but it was more lethal, meaning that those who were infected were more likely to die from SARS-1 compared to SARS-2. So we have a situation where some people are more vulnerable. Apparently, many young children get COVID-19, and they don't even realize that they have COVID-19. So we can have many tragic situations. I know I have a friend, a former colleague, who unfortunately passed away almost 2 months ago. And her son, who was young and healthy, didn't know that he was infected, came home and he infected her. Now he feels so remorseful about what has happened, and he feels very guilty, and he's affecting his mental health very seriously. So we can have all kinds of outcomes, you know. It's not just a question of whether you're infected, whether you die, or things like that. There are so many other aspects of this pandemic which we need to think about. But coming back to the situation, so in China, as they were trying to learn how to deal with the crisis, at first they were not quite sure, but finally, just before Chinese New Year, at the end of January last year, the Chinese government declared a stay-in-shelter lockdown. Stay-in-shelter lockdown basically means you cannot go out, you have to stay at home, you cannot go to work, and so on. Now, this stay-in-shelter lockdown initially introduced in Wuhan city, but also in the 3 provinces around. Hubei, of course, is where Wuhan is, but there are 2 other provinces. Why? Because the population which works in Wuhan city, in the industrial zone in Wuhan city, comes from the 3 different provinces, not just from Hubei, because of the positioning of Wuhan. And this is very important for people to realize that, you know, why there was a stay-in-shelter lockdown imposed there. But there was no stay-in-shelter lockdown introduced in the rest of China. And I want to emphasize this because if we look at what has happened in the world, there is a big difference between what has happened in East Asia, broadly speaking, and if you contrast that with what has happened in the West. Generally speaking, in East Asia, okay, not only outside of Wuhan and the 3 provinces, but outside of that, there was no stay-in-shelter lockdown imposed. In Japan, the second country which was very highly infected in the early months was Korea. And Korea, even in Daegu, where the biggest infections were, stay-in-shelter lockdown. Okay, so I'll refer to stay-in-shelter lockdowns as just simply lockdowns. Okay, but that what we in Malaysia call MCOs. Okay, now, so what happened with this stay-in-shelter lockdown in Daegu in Korea, they didn't have, not even in Daegu. Likewise, in Japan, they didn't have any stay-in-shelter lockdown. In Taiwan province of China, there was no stay-in-shelter lockdown either. In Vietnam, there have been stay-in-shelter lockdowns only in certain communes. Okay, just imagine, it's like a part of Hanoi, you know, and a part of a city, not even in the whole city were there stay-in-shelter lockdowns imposed. So the work which was done was very important. And Vietnam is a poorer country; it's poorer than Malaysia, and yet able to control the crisis. So I think what we see now is that although there was some early success in Malaysia, there were also some problems and some failures as well. So I think it is very important for us to remember that the government recognized the seriousness of this problem. The previous government recognized the seriousness of the problem by the second week of February. In the Economic Council at that time, it was agreed that action needed to be taken, and the Prime Minister asked the Finance Minister to quickly rush a bill to ensure sufficient supplementary financing to cope with the contagion. Okay, so, but of course, as we know, there were some very important mistakes made also, some very important gaps, and there was a big cluster called tabligh cluster. Now, the main reason for mentioning a tabligh cluster, not because it was the only cluster, was because there were about 18,000 people, about 2,000 of whom were from abroad, from other countries in the region, including Bangladesh and India. And many of them were infected, and they spread the COVID-19 to the other countries in the region. Southern Philippines, Indonesia, Southern Thailand, Singapore, and so on. So you have a big, massive spreading through there. But what was very disappointing in the case of Malaysia was that although this was quickly recognized, there was not enough testing and contact tracing done. Well, let me focus on the contact tracing, because for the testing to be done, you need to first identify who might have been infected. Out of the 18,000, as I said, almost 2,000 were probably foreigners and 16,000 were Malaysians. And out of those 16,000, almost 5,000 were not traced. So you just imagine, it's about 30% of the people of the Malaysians who attended the gathering were not traced. So they were not traced, they were not tested. And this is a very big problem. So the problem in Malaysia is that one of the problems in Malaysia, the Malaysian approach, at least the first round, was that a lot of weaknesses in terms of contact tracing. And the current approach in terms of contact tracing relies very much on methods in requiring digital equipment, a smartphone and so on and so forth, or writing your name and so on and so forth. Fairly primitive, when you compare it with what other countries in the region have been able to do. And this, I think, is very unfortunate. For a country which claims to be almost a developed country, almost a high-income country, this is very strange and really quite inexcusable. And it's also the seriousness of the problem is also reflected in the fact that schools have been suspended. And the insistence of the Ministry of Health in continuing classes relying on digital equipment, and less than 10% of the children in this country have access to digital equipment. And so they have been deprived of schooling for 1 year now because of the major disruptions which have taken place. This is a major calamity. It's a major setback for the education of the younger generation and so on. And added to that is a situation where we have a lot of young children, especially poor children, who rely very much on the meal which they have in schools for their nutrition. Many children, poor families, they don't have enough to eat at home, and going to school, especially if you have a good menu, and unfortunately many of the menus are not very good, but increasingly the Ministry of Health has been able to influence the menus, and the menus have improved. So you can see that you can also that those children who are either not being fed, or if they are being fed with things which are very convenient, rice, noodles, and so on and so forth, without the nutrients, the micronutrients, which are very, very badly needed. So coming back to the treatment of the first outbreak, was that it spread for a while, and very quickly thereafter, when the new government, after it had seized power, so through the essentially what is a coup d'etat, during this period for about 3 weeks or so, yeah, some people say more than 3 weeks, 4 weeks, there was basically nothing much done because of the transition, and so set back further. So, you know, I would like to think that if without the coup d'etat, we might have reacted differently. If you look at the world today, if you look at the countries which have been able to grow during the last year, during the year 2020, it is mainly countries in East Asia, because they managed to contain the contagion without resorting to stay in shelter lockdowns. In other words, commercial life, economic life very much continued while the population involved were mobilized to take precautionary measures. In Malaysia, we did take some precautionary measures, undoubtedly. This is important to recognize. But at the same time, I think we could have done much, much better as everybody now recognizes. Now, I think one of the major problems is that we lacked an all-of-government approach. Although we have the largest ever cabinet in the history of this country, okay, the cabinet was quite dysfunctional. There was no coherence in terms of the actions of the cabinet, and very often the whole treatment of the pandemic was left very much to the Prime Minister and to the Director General of Health. Very few other people were involved, except the Senior Minister for Defense, who also happened to take charge of security issues, and so was actually covering a lot of what the Ministry of Home Affairs was involved with. So it was basically seen as a public health plus police, you know, approach to this. The rest, so if we contrast this, for example, with Korea, with Japan, where public transport arrangements were radically transformed, work schedules were radically changed to ensure that there would not be too many people traveling in public transportation at the same time, to spread out the working day and so on and so forth. All this was done in many, many other countries, but instead of looking east, we were looking west. And the action which was taken in Malaysia happened after the British government changed its position. The British government initially took what was called, let us develop herd immunity. In other words, let enough people get infected and then all of us can survive. Then when they realized, because Imperial College of London did a study and showed there will be many, many people who will die, much more than previously believed, then the British government changed its position, I think 17th of March, if I'm not mistaken. And shortly thereafter, the Malaysian government changed its position. So despite Tun Mahathir's talk about looking east and so on during the first half of the 1980s, we are still very much looking west, and we fail to learn from the experiences and the lessons from our East Asian neighbors. Now, of course, as you know, that stay in shelter lockdowns are to some extent successful if you measure it in terms of containing the contagion. Because when you force people not to interact with one another or not to go out of your accommodation, obviously there will be less interaction, and because the virus is transmitted by aerosol means, okay, the likelihood of transmission will be significantly reduced, and so you will have less infections. And so there was a so-called flattening of the curve, which took place during the first after the first MCO, and so people claim success. But in fact, just doing that by such a crude, blunt means, such as the MCO, such as lockdowns, is not really very wise, because you are disrupting economic life. You're disrupting the lives of many, many people. And although, to the credit of the government, they had the so-called Prihatin measures, which did help some people, we find that there were several groups who largely ignored, and they, for example, have of course suffered a great deal. I'm referring to two particular groups. One are the smallest types of business people, you know, hawkers and so on and so forth. Very little was done for them. Very little was done. People talk a lot about SMEs, but I'm talking about family businesses which are even smaller than SMEs, you know, hiring one or two or, you know, people at the most, you know, these kinds of businesses. So it's a we are talking, so many of them, and the estimates of this proportion of the population is somewhere around 15 to 20% of the population had their lives disrupted. Another very vulnerable group, of course, were the so-called daily rated workers. That means the poorest workers in Malaysia. They were not able to work, and because they are paid, as the name implies, daily rated, if you don't work, you don't get any income. And so many of them suffered a great deal as well. So we have these two groups which were suffering. I think many immigrant workers, foreign workers, were also very much affected, but we have no idea how many there are. Now, according to the Minister of Human Resources around in the middle of the last decade, he estimated there were 6.7 million workers, foreign workers in Malaysia. Out of that 6.7 million, 2.2 are recognized by the labor force survey. In other words, about 4.5 million are not recognized. About 2/3 of the foreign workers in this country are not even recognized, and they are all large, undocumented. So the number of foreign workers in this country is huge. And when you consider that the size of the Malaysian labor force is less than 16 million, if you take the 2.2 million foreign workers out of that, it leaves 14 million. And 6.7 compared to 14 million means that 1/3 of the Malaysian labor force is foreign, of whom 2/3 are undocumented. So it is a huge proportion of the population which we are talking about. And so any kind of silly, drastic measure which says, oh, throw away, get rid of all the foreign workers and so on, is not wise in my view. In fact, when you hurt foreign workers, you hurt Malaysian workers. And this, I think, is something which people have to realize, because we have a very shameful view towards foreign workers in terms of our treatment of foreign workers and so on. Let me come back quickly to this question. As you know, the so-called second wave in Singapore was largely due to the fact that they ignored the problems of the foreign workers. Now, the foreign workers in this country work in even more live in more cramped conditions than the foreign workers in Singapore. And so we were asking for trouble. And although the first announcement by the Director General of Health was clear that everybody was going to be treated, after that, we find that various ministers announced, no, foreign workers will not be treated. So what does this do? This drives them further underground. So we have what finally was acknowledged a few months ago was a problem which we, pretending it didn't exist in this country, and then by pretending that they would not be the cause, and that somehow or other the virus looks at somebody's passport, you know, whether or not to infect somebody. This is all, we were all kidding ourselves, and we made so many mistakes, unnecessary mistakes. You know, in football language, this is like kicking into your own goal. You know, this is the kind of mistakes which we were making. So what we also find is that, for example, with the Sabah state election, the Sabah state election resulted in a spike and big increase in cases in Sabah. But I think it's very interesting to note that in the case of Sabah, two things have happened. Number one, we find that that it has come down better than in some other states in Malaysia. And part of the reason is that in Sabah, they use a cheaper type of test, antigen test, on a very mass scale. Okay, many people will tell you that, oh, the antigen tests are not 100% reliable. Of course, it's true. It's not 100% reliable. But at least getting a rough idea is better than having no idea whatsoever. Whereas the PCR tests are much, much more expensive. And so even the Ministry of Health with a very limited budget has to think twice about this. So we have a lot of problems of this type. But I want to emphasize, go back to the question of having an all-of-government approach. And the other problem, of course, is a whole-of-society approach. You must educate the people. The people must understand what is going on so that they can support the measures which are introduced by the government. Unfortunately, not much was done in this regard. Of course, Malaysia is a very multicultural society, and there are a lot of differences among the Malaysian population, where they live, how they work, how they interact, and so on. Nonetheless, much, much more could have been done to involve the population, to educate the population. And we can see, for example, in countries like Vietnam, in Laos, in Kerala, and so on and so forth, a high level of public consciousness was so important for the success of those efforts there. Now, let me quickly run quickly to the situation in early November. In early November, as everybody knows, a new budget was announced, and the new budget arguably made very, very optimistic predictions about economic recovery. I think it's very important for people to realize what numbers can be very misleading if people don't understand the numbers. Let us take the United States. During the second quarter of last year, 2020, the US economy dropped by 33% in the second quarter. In the third quarter, it went up 33%. Now, does that mean you went back to the original level? No, because you are starting from a lower base in the third quarter. So 33% improvement from the lower base means that you are still more than 10% short of your original starting position. So it's very important for us to remember these numbers. Many of these numbers don't mean very much. You know, everybody doesn't know what is going to happen. Everybody is guessing, okay? So if somebody tells me, oh, so IMF said this, the World Bank said this, almost every day they're changing their numbers internally. Nobody knows. If they know, I can tell you they got a great career ahead as a fortune teller. But don't tell me they are doing this on the basis of economics, okay? Because nobody really knows, okay? And this is unfortunately part of the problem. So we had very optimistic projections which were made, and of course those projections are almost meaningless now. But more importantly, it is important to recognize that up to that point, yeah, that means before the last quarter, Malaysia was doing relatively better than many other countries in the world. Not as good as some of the East Asian countries I mentioned, but certainly better than many other countries in the world. But the situation, unfortunately, has deteriorated. Okay, you can say that politics was part of the problem in Sabah, but the situation has deteriorated elsewhere as well. And part of the problem is that we are not doing enough testing, we are not doing enough contact tracing, and we do not know, we have not had a more differentiated way of dealing with COVID-19 cases. Because now it is clear that COVID-19 affects different people differently. Even if people of the same age group can be affected differently. And of course, older people are much more vulnerable. So there should be some differentiation of cases in terms of the kind of facilities they are put in and so on and so forth. And so because everybody is in, if you put too many people in Sungai Buloh, what happens is that the capacity is basically exhausted. And now with the concentration in the Klang Valley area in the recent period, we have a very, very serious problem. So it is not very meaningful to talk about the fact that there are empty beds in Kota Baru, or that there are empty beds in Kuching, because those national figures do not mean very much. What matters is what is happening on the ground. So we have seen many other countries have been able to build. China, for example, built facilities within a week. you have fairly significant facilities made available. And we could have prepared much better. We could make much more facilities available, and it's still possible. It's still not too late to do some of that. But ultimately, we have a situation now where politics is affecting policy. And this is part of the tragedy of the situation. So undoubtedly, there was a need for more drastic actions to be taken at the beginning of this year, for the reasons which we all know. But whether another MCO is going to do the trick, I'm afraid not, for the reasons I have mentioned earlier. And what we find, of course, is that the ruling coalition is very, very unstable. It's not unstable only because it has a very, very narrow majority, if it still has a majority, but more importantly, even within the coalition, it is not very strong. There's a lot of unhappiness and so on. Now, I don't want to get into the details of this, and everybody has their own view about this, but I think all this does not. So we have a situation where on Monday, an MCO was announced. And at this time the MCO was being announced, the Prime Minister was apparently meeting with the Yang di-Pertuan Agong. And the Yang di-Pertuan Agong agreed to an emergency. Now, it's important to remember that in Malaysia, we have had many emergencies. From 1948 to 1960, there was an emergency. But Parliament was elected in 1959, and it met during that emergency. There was a second emergency during confrontasi with Indonesia after the formation of Malaysia. Again, Parliament continued to meet. There was an emergency in the case mentioned by the Prime Minister, in the case of Sarawak, the case involving Stephen Kalong Ningkan. But Parliament continued to meet. Likewise, we find that the only case, there were other emergencies, for example, in the case of Kelantan and so on and so forth. But the only time when Parliament was suspended was following May 69. And I think many people would say, yes, there was a need to suspend Parliament at that time. But I think there will be very few people who really feel that this situation right now calls for the suspension of Parliament. Okay? The suspension of Parliament right now does not enjoy much credibility. And this, I think, further undermines the legitimacy of the government. It's very, very difficult for the government to rule in these circumstances. Suspending Parliament only extends the life of a very weak and unstable government, which, although it is huge in terms of the cabinet size, is not able to govern very well, and unfortunately has not been able to take on the measures. Now, various professionals, the so-called group of 46, I was one of the two non-doctors in that group of 46 who called for a reconsideration of the measures being undertaken. And I think there are many people who, even in government service and so on, who recognize that what is being done is non-optimal, that we are not going to solve the problem the way we are going. But many people feel that they have no choice. So let's do the best in the circumstances we have. But unfortunately, I feel it's not as easy as that. A situation which is fast deteriorating, where confidence is deteriorating. And we have, very many people try to emphasize that, foreign direct investment in Malaysia has gone down much more than in other countries in Southeast Asia and so on and so forth. All that is well and true, but to me, that is less important. What is important is Malaysian investors, not foreign investors. If Malaysian investors do not feel confident, and when you have such instability, it is very difficult for them. It's a combination of economic and political stability. When you do not have that stability, it's very, very difficult for them to make the investments. And without making the needed investments, it is very difficult for the economy to be on a new basis for Malaysia to be competitive as we try to recover. We are being left behind. for a variety of reasons. And this is the risk which we run. So although we were probably arguably the second most developed country in ASEAN before, we run the risk right now. Investments are far more significant elsewhere. And I think the focus on foreign investments is a problem. We must look at local investments, but it's understandable investors are reluctant to make any major such an uncertain situation. So we have a situation which unfortunately is going to go from bad to worse, and we need a total solution. And what happens when you do not have parliamentary accountability, when parliament is suspended? It basically means that you do not have people to deal with the problem. So, Heng, I think we have covered a lot of issues. I've taken a bit more longer than I meant to take, but I think let me stop here so we can have a few questions and answers before we conclude.
Sure. Okay. Thank you, Professor Jomo. Yeah. Okay. So before I ask further questions, I want to thank Astro Avani because I've just seen that not only Kini TV, we are also having Facebook Live concurrently at Astro Avani. So basically, you can watch the webinar either at KLSCAH or Kini TV or Astro Avani Facebook Live. Yeah, and currently, as I have seen, at Astro Avani, you have more than 100 viewers. Okay, now back to the presentation of Prof. Jomo. Prof. Jomo has covered, I think, various dimensions related to the pandemic as well as the economy. So when Prof. Jomo mentioned about the contact tracing, 30% were not traced, immediately there's one thing coming to my mind, come across my mind is the MySejahtera. You know, I've heard a few times friends talking about the MySejahtera, whether it's functioning or not, because everybody is using the MySejahtera, but is the government using the MySejahtera or not? You know, we follow the SOP, but we are not sure how effective is the MySejahtera being used by the government to do the contact tracing. That's one thing. And then the second one, when Prof. Jomo touched on the digital equipment, less than 10% of the students have digital equipment. I think the same thing, many of our friends who are parents, you know, they were worried about the stolen year of the students since 2020. And there was even discussion whether we should ask the student to repeat 1 year or not, you know. And then the other comment by Prof. Jomo is on the lack of government approach. The largest cabinet, but dysfunctional. Indeed, recently when the number has crossed the 5,000 figure, I've seen on the Facebook, many have been asking, where is the health minister? You know, not the health minister is not there, but then, you know, what the health minister has been doing, and we are not informed, you know, of what he has been doing so far and how effective is health minister and as well as his ministry dealing with the current situation. And then, okay, now there are still a lot of other points being covered by Prof. Jomo. I'll come back to that. But in the meantime, let me read you some of the questions. I have received, I think, about 7 questions from the audience. I'll read the questions, and then later we will ask Prof. Jomo each one of them. But right, okay, the first question, why is our economy slowing down despite ongoing production activities? Mass production is creating more wealth for the rich. This is causing the rich-poor gap to widen further, as well as social imbalance. Under the pandemic, is there a possibility to rise the economy? Will people be able to place food on the table and get vaccinated at the same time? You know, that is the first question. And then the second question, as many sectors continue to rely on foreign labor, is it still okay to keep employing them at low wages? What can local employers do to counter this issue? Okay, the third question, with the current state of emergency, what should have been made clear in order to not affect FDI from decreasing. Yeah, I remember just now Prof. Jomo have also mentioned, indeed it's not the FDI, but it's the domestic investment which is important, because the emergency is affecting their stability. But of course, we will let Prof. Jomo answering that question. Okay, now the fourth question. What are the reasons for the high GDP growth rate being reported in the media? I think Prof. Jomo has covered on the lower base. We'll see if Prof. Jomo want to elaborate further on this. Okay, the fifth question. Yesterday, Lazada has launched a donation drive for University Malaya Medical Center to receive donations from online shoppers. Could this be the start of sustainable collaborations between e-commerce platforms and the healthcare sector? Okay, that's number 5. Okay, the question number 6. Malaysia's economy is facing huge challenges, especially the COVID-19 and the government's declaration of emergency. Again on emergency, and its implication on the economy. If the COVID-19 has not subsided and broke out again, will the country's economy in 2021, I think will the country's economy growth in 2021? What is the impact of it on the financial system in Malaysia? Will it recover with the new US government and the COVID-19 vaccines? Thank you. So you also asked a question about whether there will be a new policy by the US government, and with the COVID-19 vaccines, will it change what we are currently facing? Okay, question number 7. Are you confident that if vaccine will increase our economy, while the political is not over yet, while people is not confident of Perikatan Nasional by Prime Minister? I think basically he's asking about, even with a vaccine, but under a state of emergency, and given that the people is not confident of the Perikatan Nasional government led by the Prime Minister Tan Sri Muhyiddin Yassin, the vaccine help, and how is the economy under the state of emergency? Okay, so there are 7 questions. I think I will start with the last question, because Prof. Jomo, the last part of that you mentioned is about the emergency. So would you like to comment first on that question? Even with vaccine under the state emergency, how will it have? Okay, I should put it this way: will emergency helped, and with vaccine, how will our economy growth? Prof. Jomo, pass it over to you.
Thank you. I'm not sure I understand the last question, but I think it's very important to remember that firstly, there are huge problems with vaccine which we need to consider. The problems are not the usual problems which we find in the media, in the social media now. There are a lot of people how dangerous it is and this and that and so on. I'm not so concerned about that. I'm also not concerned about the fact that the vaccine is not 100% effective, because we have to remember that these vaccines were really rushed. We were quickly developed and you cannot expect 100% success rate. Even if you have a 50% success rate, it does help, as long as it doesn't do any harm. And the basic principle in medicine is do no harm. That's the first principle in medicine. So I think and then of course, in the case of Norway, for example, quite a number of older people who were over 85 years old, who were vaccinated, they died. So what we now know from experience, from this tragic experience, is that there are certain things which we shouldn't do. We shouldn't force older people who are more vulnerable to be vaccinated and so on and so forth. We need to be just very, very careful and quickly learn from experience. I think there are 3 very, very important sources of learning. One, we have to learn from our successes as well as our mistakes. Secondly, we have to learn from the science which is changing all the time, because we are learning more and more things. Almost every day, I'm not a medical scientist, but I'm learning so many things And the problem, of course, for many people, for young people, is that they learn a lot of things from social media. And the social media people are actually doing a lot of disservice. Because there's a lot of nonsense which is going around in the social media. They're creating problems which in theory may even exist, but it is irrelevant. For example, to say that, oh, if you are vaccinated, a certain amount, nano amount of something will go to your brain and so on and so forth. But the thing is that vaccine does not contain those things. You see? So you have a lot of created, imagined problems compounding. I'm not saying there are no problems. There are problems, but don't make the problems even more difficult and worse. So unfortunately, we have a lot of that going around, and unfortunately, some of the religious groups are contributing to a lot of this. I'm sorry, I have to use the very this nonsense. This nonsense. So, what do we have? The thing is that the emergency doesn't do anything. The emergency doesn't do anything except it postpones, it suspends Parliament, which reduces accountability. Now, I'm the first one to argue that in this exceptional situation, you need to have urgent authorization of many things, because many things will happen and will not, and it's very difficult to go to Parliament and so on. For example, we had floods last month, okay, or in December. You know, you need to do something about it. You can't wait until you go to Parliament to handle it. Likewise, in a public health emergency, you will have unexpected expenses and so on and so forth. So there's a need for that. But at the same time, Parliament ensures that you do not have abuses. Parliament ensures that, for example, that the method, the means by which you determine the correct, the choice of vaccines, is the best possible means. We do not just, select certain. Somebody has a contact with so and so, which is unfortunately has happened in the past in this country. So understandably, people are suspicious about this. The only way to get around that suspicion is by basically ensuring that you have transparency and accountability. And only Parliament can, well, not only Parliament, but Parliament is a very, very important part of that. And so suspension of Parliament does not inspire confidence. It actually causes even less confidence, which is what the government desperately needs in the present situation. So there are many ways out of this. Perhaps the young Diputan Agong might consider, for example, that the situation is so you might need to have a temporary government of national unity, or some other arrangements can be made. But basically, if we continue the way we are going, I'm afraid the situation is going to go from bad to worse.
Okay, thanks, Professor Jomo. Okay, someone has just donated a 50 ringgit. We want to say thank you, and we welcome more people to contribute. And it can be made to the KL and Selangor Chinese Assembly Hall, Public Bank, 3077-3401-27. Okay, back to the questions. We have received another question. So it's a continuation of what Prof. Jomo has commented on the emergency. Okay, the question is, will the attempt to challenge the legitimacy of PM's advice be successful? What options do we have if that fails? Yeah, Prof. Jomo, would you want to comment on that? Yeah.
Frankly, I don't have any comments on this because I'm not involved in many of these things. I'm very busy trying to understand what is happening on the public health front, not only nationally as well as internationally. I'm trying to make a big, major proposal so that there will be a significant increase in availability of vaccines. Right now, the vaccines, the information about the vaccines is supposed to be shared. Okay, just like when you had the genome sequencing in China at the beginning of last year, yeah, that information was made available within weeks. And all that is very important, because when you have more and more information, you develop an understanding of the virus, and then you develop the vaccine, and you are able to do certain things. This is part of the reason why this vaccine development is so fast. I'm not saying that therefore it solves all problems, but part of the reason is because a lot of information has been shared. But now, by companies not being willing to share this, and they've already received a lot of funding. Whatever you might say about President Donald Trump, he put in a lot of money into so-called Operation Warp Speed to accelerate the development of vaccines. But without that, so you have a new company, a relatively small company like Moderna, okay, including people whom I know who are formerly, who are previously associated with MIT. In fact, the head office of Moderna is right there in MIT. So you have these people who have developed this vaccine, but they do not have the capacity to scale it up. The biggest capacity to manufacture vaccines is actually in India, the Serum Institute. If you make it available, the generic producers can produce. And it doesn't mean that Moderna is going to get less profits. They already got paid by Donald Trump. They are already selling to the US government and to private suppliers in the US and also abroad. Many people all over the world think that the Moderna vaccine is the best, but the production levels are so slow. And so, the one of the United Nations is no one left behind. But you can be sure that developing countries are being left behind, and the poorer people are being left behind. This is the nature of the world today. But the poorer people and developing countries are also going to be infected. You cannot think that just by them, because they are out of sight, out of mind. The fact is that as long as the virus exists, people can be infected. And just because one is vaccinated, it doesn't mean, this is something which Dr. Fauci has pointed out, and the chief medical officer of Moderna has pointed out, that just because you are not, just because you cannot be infected, doesn't mean you are not infectious, meaning that you can infect other people. You may not suffer yourself, but you can do it to your loved ones, your parents when you go and visit them, or your children, and your children can infect the neighbors, their friends, parents, and so on and so forth. So you can see that you have to deal with the whole of society. The whole of society has to be involved in wiping this out. It doesn't mean that everybody must be vaccinated. For various reasons, not everybody needs to be vaccinated, but you need to be able to vaccinate a significant share of the society. Some people say 70%, some people say 85%, whatever it is, there's no consensus, but the point is that it has to be a fairly high number, and that has to be achieved. But we right now we have tried to do it the usual way, and nobody is playing by the rules. You look at the rich countries; they are buying vaccines to vaccinate their people 4 or 5 times. 4 or 5 times. What do you need so much for? Partly because they are not confident about the vaccines themselves. So they want to have a choice between vaccine A, vaccine B, vaccine C, and what they want to pick and choose. But it basically means that those vaccines are already committed to them. They are not and those vaccines cannot be available for the rest of the world. And by not sharing that information, by not allowing, say, the Serum Institute of India and others to scale up the production of vaccines, affecting lives and livelihoods, we are slowing down the world economy, we are hurting ourselves because of the greed of a few people. So it's a combination of vaccine nationalism plus money, the greed, which is causing many of these problems.
Okay, thanks, Prof. Jomo. Now back to the earlier question number 3. Would you like to comment, with the current state of emergency, what should have been made clear in order to not affect FDI? from decreasing?
Well, as I said earlier, to me, foreign direct investment in most countries, maybe Singapore is an exception, but most countries, foreign direct investment follows domestic investment. They look at what domestic investors are doing and then they go in. Sometimes they come in with their own special characteristics, okay? But that is the trend throughout the world, okay? So when we, so looking at foreign direct investment is useful, but it is not the end all. We must remember that more than 90% of total investment in this country, real investments, is local, is by Malaysians. So we must look at what is happening with Malaysians. Why are they investing? Why are they not investing? What can be done to induce greater certainty, and so on and so forth. Okay, if you want to treat, you say, oh, we want to help the investors, then you want to be tough on investors because they have been abusing their for example, the foreign labor. Then you have to be uniformly tough. You cannot take the second largest company in the country and then give a small token, not even a slap in the wrist, it's like touching the wrist, and then you treat the company like that, and at the same time you don't even introduce windfall profits at a time when the country desperately needs resources, financial resources, fiscal resources.
Okay, thanks, Prof. Jomo. We received the other two questions. So one of them is how to restore confidence and what options available to reverse emergency. That means how to restore confidence in a state of emergency and what options available to reverse emergency. Yeah, would you like to comment on that?
Well, this emergency is so special and so unique. There's no rule. I mean, even the word emergency itself, the meaning of emergency differs from country to country. Japan declared a state of emergency 2 weeks ago. After the invasion of the capital, President Trump declared a state of emergency. But it doesn't mean that Congress doesn't meet. Or in the case of Japan, it doesn't mean the Diet doesn't meet. So, you cannot, just using the word emergency doesn't mean anything without looking at the specific context. So how do you restore confidence? If people don't believe you, if the public doesn't believe you, do you expect foreign investors to believe you? Do you expect domestic investors to believe you if the ordinary people believe you? I mean, people are not stupid. Investors particularly are going to think very carefully before they invest their money. Okay? So you want to restore investment confidence? I can understand why that's a priority. But you cannot do it by deception. You have to win the confidence of the people. That's why you need an all of government, a whole of society approach. And that, unfortunately, has been missing almost from the beginning.
Okay, thanks, Prof. Jomo. Now, back to the first question. Why is our economy slowing down despite ongoing production activities? Mass production is creating more wealth for the rich. This is causing the rich-poor gap to widen further, as well as social imbalance. Under the pandemic, is there a possibility to stabilize the economy? Will people be able to place food on the table and get vaccinated at the same time? Yeah, that's a question.
As I emphasized in the presentation earlier, that East Asian countries have been able to contain the contagion, have been able to deal with the pandemic without disrupting economic life unnecessarily. It doesn't mean nothing happens. It doesn't mean everybody carries on as usual. A lot of precautionary measures are taking place in all the countries I mentioned earlier: Japan, Korea, Taiwan, China, Vietnam, and so on. People are taking a lot of measures. But those measures do not require lockdown. That's why I keep on saying lockdown is a very blunt measure. It's not very effective. It's not very effective. Tracing, testing, etc. is far more important. The Director General of Health asked for much more money than he received. He received less than half of what he received than what he asked for. So I don't know whether there is a shortage of funding for the Director of General Health measures, but if you cannot fault somebody, if you don't even provide him with the means to carry out the measures necessary. There are rumors, for example, and somebody has even shown me a document, but nowadays you cannot believe everything you see. I've seen a document which claims that only those who have symptoms will be tested. Okay, only those which have them. Now, we know that about half the people who are infected are asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic. Okay? Pre-symptomatic means that the first few days before the symptoms appear, you don't have the symptoms. That is a very high proportion of the population. The only way of finding out is by having tests. I can understand why you don't want to do the expensive test, the PCR test, because it's so expensive. But you can do a first screening through antigen testing. There are more and more, there are better and better antigen tests which are being developed all the time. Antigen tests are much cheaper, less than 10%. Some people say less than 5% of what a PCR test costs. And it's already being used in Malaysia. For example, somebody arrives in KLIA, or somebody arrives in across the border, land border, they will be subjected to an antigen test. The people in Sabah were subjected to, they use antigen tests, and that's part of the reason, as I pointed out earlier, the cases in Sabah have come down. So yes, antigen tests are not as good as PCR tests, but it allows you to test a lot of people. And it's very important to test a lot of people because the relationship between infection and symptoms and so on is it varies a lot. And just because you don't have symptoms doesn't mean you're not infected. And just because you're not, and the fact that you're infected usually means that you can infect others. And now with vaccination, even if you're not infected, you can infect others. And this is the part of the problem with vaccination. You can have a false sense that, oh, I'm safe and therefore I cannot infect other people. That's wrong. The first part is right. You're not going to get sick, but it doesn't mean that you cannot infect other people. So these are things which need to be understood, and there are all kinds of problems. These are problems which many countries are facing. That is why it is very important for us to learn from other countries, and we need to learn how Korea did it, how Taiwan did it, how Japan did it, how Vietnam has done it. Okay, everybody will say Japan is too expensive and so on and so forth. Look at Vietnam. Vietnam is much poorer than us, and they have been able to do it. So it's testing, very, very important. Contact tracing, very important. And we cannot just rely on MySejahtera. How many people use smartphones? Okay, you and I, maybe we use smartphones. Maybe everybody who's listening to this program is using a smartphone, but it doesn't mean that everybody has a smartphone. Okay, a lot of people have phones, undoubtedly, but it's not necessarily a smartphone. You need a smartphone to be able to use MySejahtera, and we don't even know how many people are using it properly and well. Okay, so there are other measures as well. But the fact of the matter is that we have to improve contact tracing, and we cannot leave it entirely to MOH personnel. We have to train a lot of people who are aware of the dangers of the disease and who know what they are looking for. In many other countries, contact tracing does not involve doctors. It does not involve nurses. It does not involve the usual trained health personnel. They're using a lot of other people to do that kind of contact tracing. And this is very, very important. So we can improve our methods, and we must not be shy to use methods which might have worked, which were used before, but now we consider them backward. For example, we have, in Malaysia, we use a lot of TV pendidikan, radio pendidikan in the past. What is wrong? Most of the population has access to TV and radio, at least 90%. Why can't we use radio and TV? Because we are afraid of being not part of Industrial Revolution 4.0. We are afraid of being called 3.0 or something. This is stupid pride. We have to be pragmatic. We are dealing with a crisis which will drag on and will have many, many consequences if we do not get our act together.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Jomo. Now we receive another new question. We talk and discuss about all these challenges everywhere, but the government is seemingly not hearing it at all. Will this country become the sick man of Asia? Yeah, what do you think?
That kind of dramatic question you ask the politicians.
Okay.
As I said before,
yeah.
Maybe you can criticize me for being an economist. On the one hand, this, on the other hand, that. As I said before, we have done better, okay, in many countries, but we have done very poorly compared to East Asian countries, to the ones I mentioned especially. Even Thailand has done better. And part of the reason, if you look at some of the studies, is a very interesting study in a journal which many people respect called The Lancet. That journal that article argues that Thailand has done well, mainly because of increasing investments in public health over the last couple of decades. Some of people maybe can remember when Thaksin has been very popular in Thailand, mainly because of very simple reforms which she introduced. And one of the major reforms she introduced was the so-called $1 per hospital visit. Basically, you can get medical attention for equivalent of $1, 30 baht. Okay, in those days. Yeah? And that was all you needed, and you basically get universal health coverage within a few decades. This was achieved by Thailand. Thailand, the health indicators used to be far behind Malaysia's. Malaysia used to do very well. In fact, we spent money on health, but we used to do much better than, on education. We spend so much money on education, but our indicators are very poor on education. But health, we used to be very good. But now, things have deteriorated for a few decades. I don't think it's the fault of this government alone. And unfortunately, it has gone worse. Relying on the private sector and thinking that the private sector is going to solve the problems of society is a very, very dangerous misconception.
Okay, thanks, Prof. Jomo. We keep receiving questions. There's one more question coming in. How can we encourage sectors in Malaysia to use radio and TV to bolster our education system? Okay, let me get back to the earlier questions. Okay, there's one question on foreign labor. As many sectors continue to rely on foreign labor, is it still okay to keep employing them at low wages? What can local employers do to counter this issue, given what happened during the pandemic? Yeah, would you like to answer that question?
Firstly, I think we have to remember that the reason there are so many foreign workers in this country is because we have become very dependent on them. And we have become very dependent on them because local employers prefer them, because they are prepared to work hard under very poor conditions and for very poor wages. So if you think that the local employers are going to be the solution, think again. They are part of the problem, okay? And this is part of the reason why we have these problems. because, I mean, foreign labor has been in this country for at least 3 decades, 4 decades, I would say, you know. But there were many people who took the view that this, you know, we treat the foreign workers badly. You know, even some trade unionists took that kind of a view. And basically they thought that by treating them badly, we would be better off. That's not the way things work. You treat them badly, that means that we have to start competing with them. Our own workers will get treated badly as well. So I don't think the problem is a question of looking to the foreign workers for solutions. I mean, sorry, the employers of foreign workers for solutions. They are part of the problem, you know. But to say that, oh, let's get rid of them overnight, you know, we are like cutting off your nose to spite your face because you're angry with your face for something else. You go and cut your nose off. What for? You know, that's not the way to solve the problem. So we need to begin to realize that the welfare of Malaysians is intimately related to the presence of the foreign workers too. And we have to improve for the Malaysian workers and the foreign workers. You know, the two go hand in hand. I think we're not going to solve the problem by relying on our local employers, you know, to expel the foreign workers. Unfortunately, that's simply not going to happen. And it's not a very good solution. There are certain sectors of the economy now which would collapse without the foreign workers. Plantation agriculture, even smallholder agriculture, construction, security services, and so on and so forth. All these are heavily dependent on foreign workers right now. You expel the foreign workers overnight, you're going to hurt yourself terribly. Okay, so don't do anything against foreign workers. Improve their conditions. That's the best thing you can do to help Malaysians.
Okay, thanks, Prof. Jomo. Again, new question coming in. The question, I think, is quite a good one. We seem to be having a deadlock between private hospitals and insurance corporations. Any comments on how to overcome this deadlock? Yeah.
Heng, I'm not sure what the question is. I'm not involved with insurance companies or with private hospitals, so I cannot answer that question. But I have to tell you that I have to go off in about 5 minutes. I told you that.
Okay, yeah, I promise Prof. Jomo we will end by 9:15 and now it's already 9:19. Okay, last question, and then for Prof. Jomo to conclude. My last question is this. Given the emergency, so we have seen what happened nowadays. So my question is, imagine if there is no emergency, if the parliament is on session in the coming March, so do you anticipate a different scenario? Yeah, that's the question, Prof. Jomo. Yeah.
I'm sorry, Heng, can you interpret the question for me? I don't understand.
Okay, what I'm asking is this. Now that with the emergency, we have seen what happened. We have seen the figure to cross 5,000 cases. And then we have seen that the government seems dysfunctional, as Prof has said just now. And imagine a different scenario. If there is no emergency, and then there is parliament in session, can we anticipate something different under that scenario? Yeah.
Okay, let's be very clear, okay? The MCO supposedly deals with the public health problem, okay? For various reasons, I do not believe it is the best way to handle the public health problem. We can improve on that based on experience both in Malaysia as well as abroad, and the better understanding of the ways of handling it. That's the first point. Second point is that the emergency has got nothing to do with the MCO. It's just an excuse. The COVID-19 situation is basically an excuse. Everybody knows that. Okay, so how now? Of course, the part of the problem is that the people who are the most infected, it seems, are the politicians. So many politicians are getting infected, and including ministers. I think almost 20% of the cabinet has already been infected, and you know, it seems to be going up. So whether or not you have parliament, has very little bearing on the MCO. You can have the MCO without. You can have the MCO with and have Parliament. You can have MCO with. You can suspend Parliament and still have no MCO. You know, the two are basically unrelated. You know, I mean, it's very clear. Look at what happened a few weeks ago. The MCO was announced, and then the following day, the Parliament, the emergency was announced. Okay, of course, it was justified in terms of the public health situation, but we know that in many situations, you deal with the public health situation. It's got nothing to do with the emergency. You know, so I think we have the coincidence, the timing, and the justification, official justification, okay, has confused a lot of people. But actually, the two are quite different issues. You know, and I think what we have, I'm very concerned about dealing with the COVID-19. I'm very concerned that the MCO is not dealing well with the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm sympathetic to the Ministry of Health because it seems to have one hand tied behind its back and not getting the kind of financial and other support which it needs to. But I also think that the measures which have been used need to be reconsidered. After 1 year of experience all over the world, there's so much we can learn, so much we can improve. If we just go back and do this more or less the same thing over and over again, you know, you can be sure that you're not going to get a better outcome. You know, supposing we have an MCO, we're having an MCO now, and the curve is flattened temporarily. But unless you do something about all the other problems, we are going to get back into a situation. We are going to have a WWW situation. You know, we talked about a V-shaped recovery. Now we have a W. You know, and if we just continue up, down, it's going to be WWW. You know, well, somebody will say that it's better than an M. Okay, because an M means you know, you don't even recover. Okay, but let's leaving that aside. I think we have to be very, very serious in dealing with the MCO, recognizing that there is a serious public health problem. And this, whatever it is, you know, you cannot say that whatever you might say about Perikatan National Government, you cannot blame Perikatan Nasional for the COVID-19. Okay, COVID-19 happened independently. Perikatan Nasional came in and inherited the problem and delayed the public health response to it, but it didn't do too badly at the beginning, you know. But now, I think after 1 year, the world, everybody who has kept their eyes open and sees what's happening all over the world, that we could have done much better.
Yeah.
Okay, Heng, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm sorry I have to go, but you know, I promised this other group at 9:30, and the group is well, some of them are in New York and so on, and they postponed the thing partly because of me. So it's not fair if I ask them to, if I delay further. Okay.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, thank you, Professor Jomo, and thank you, everyone. So we will be having another webinar next week. We are trying to invite someone, a former health minister, Tan Sri. Hopefully, we will get him to speak. Thank you. Till next Monday. Yeah. Thanks, Prof. Jomo.
Okay.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.